All right, so we're rolling. So first of all, welcome everybody to our August developer Q&A session. So without further ado,
All right. So, everyone here has highly likely seen that last little dev update that wasn't so little. And that, of course, was mostly just covering the things that weren't properly implemented before in the previous little dev update that is already way too long ago. And my first question out there to the audience was, so how did it go? What are you most excited for? Like, what features are anything that surprised you, or what implementation did surprise you? And are there questions about it?
you had a few people talking about the emissions being as sort of a bit of a surprise to them, and actually being kind of excited about that, which is...
It was a surprise to me as well, even though I had to work on them. No, it was mostly a surprise to me with how deep you had to go in order to make something that is actually workable. Because emissions are by nature, by the very physics of it and the chemistry of it, a bit of a bitch to model, because they are like really damn picky. And with picky, I mean lambda dependent, like to an extreme amount. As soon as you just leave lambda 0.995, you instantly get shafted in one way or the other. So that was a big surprise to me when I had to model reality. And it makes for pretty binary gameplay at first, when you only consider that and don't consider all the nuances that are to it. So it took me a while to understand all the nuances to it in terms of material choices and cam dependencies with the emissions and so on. And then, once those were considered, it turned into a quite interesting system. So it surprised me probably just as much as it will surprise people here.
Yeah, and I should also mention that it is one of the reasons why things have taken a little bit longer than we had thought to not just get the update out, but also get news out about the update, because it has been a very complicated system to implement, and there have been a few dead ends on our end, and a few issues that have come up with some of the systems that we'd built prior that made things a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole modeling of this basically required us to build the test cycles. They weren't really planned to start with. But how are you supposed to design emissions properly and emissions values properly without having the appropriate test cycles? It doesn't really work. And basically that allowed us came with the added benefit, so to say, that we are now having a proper fuel economy calculation as well. If you call it proper or not is the same question as, do you call the real tests proper or not? Because that is very much debatable, isn't it, Chris?
It is. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that we've also discovered, is that the real world test cycles are very arbitrary, and a lot of times don't really reflect how most people do their driving, which is kind of why, if anybody here has their driver's license and drives their car regularly, which I'm assuming many of you do, it's why your fuel economy that you get when you're driving your car around doesn't really match what your manufacturer publishes for it, because it's a very tightly controlled setup that they use, and you can kind of understand why, because doing tests like that in the real world are very difficult to keep consistent, so they have to constrain a lot of variables that you wouldn't really see constrained in real life. But even just the drive cycles themselves, like the speeds that you're doing, are not really very reflective of what's actually going on in the real world. Certainly these days. So we have a question here from Martinator. I'm just going to give you the opportunity to speak here, and you'll be able to go ahead. All right, go ahead, Martinator. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. Welcome to the show.
Okay. Now that you've implemented test cycles and so on, how far are you planning to take it with the test cycles? Are you, for example, planning to make the data out of the test cycles slightly inaccurate, and in the campaign enabling the player to, for example, invest in more accurate testing, more testing to get better data, or even catch perhaps construction flaws in cars.
I think that's a very interesting question, especially, well, it's more of a design question than really a calculation question, right? So, let me answer it purely from a design standpoint, game design standpoint. There are no mechanics in automation whatsoever, and very deliberately so, that obfuscate what values you are getting. Like every choice the player makes is based on data you can extract from the game that is always believable and accurate. So this would be a first, and I don't think it would quite fit in the design philosophy of automation that you try to obfuscate or make vague in some terms. And as such, I would be recommending to not go ahead with that. There are other things one could do with it in terms of campaign play, of course, but I think it is complex enough with it, all the added dependencies. I mean, with all three pollutants, and they have different dependencies, each one of them. It has added a lot of complexity already, and I think our first task will be to visualize and explain properly to the player where it's coming from and what to do against it, or how to deal with those things and so on. That's already enough of a challenge for now, so I haven't thought about where to go with it beyond that. I mean, the obvious thing is that you need to meet emission standards, and if you don't, then there is some sort of penalty, and that penalty very likely will be outside of sandbox, i.e. in campaign, will be a compliance cost, dependent on the sales price of the car and how far off you are the standard, and then you have to pay a minimum price per car sold plus a percentage of the sales price of the car that then gets all rolled into one bucket that you have to pay as taxes next year on top of what you had. That's the plan so far, but that's also the extent of where we wanted to take it at the moment.
Okay, and the errors, like the production flaws in cars in the campaign. About that, any plans, any ideas?
Do you mean in terms of emissions, or just
No,
in general?
not in terms of emissions, but for in the campaign you have of course a likelihood that the factory produces a flawed part.
Yes.
That you have to recall, of course.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it would, at least from an outside perspective, absolutely make sense to implement the test cycles in some way that enables to find these errors before cars go out into production, for example.
So that they give you some hints. How would that be implemented, though? I don't see a straightforward path there, because that would have to be, at that point, when you're designing a car, it would already have to be broken in some sense, and you would have to discover it. So it would arbitrarily decide, before you've finished your design, that this car is going to be broken, even before it has been produced. So I don't see how that would happen, but maybe you have some other idea that perfectly makes sense.
I mean, with any design in reality, there's a likelihood there's an error in design. Maybe an engineer made an error, maybe someone made an error, maybe the factory made an error. You already have a system of probability in the game that has a likelihood that a factory produces a flawed part that has some kind of error. And the thing I was thinking was that with test cycles being implemented, not only for emissions, but for example, putting, say, 1 million kilometers on a car before it goes into production, that there's a likelihood that you find that before the cars get sold.
So some kind of expanded QA options for campaign play, you mean?
Yeah, more or less. That's what I was thinking. It would make sense with the way that test cycles work.
I don't know if test cycles are the way to implement it, though. That seems like a mechanic that is between you having designed the car and it actually going into production. So I'm not sure how that would be implemented in a way that would flow well, because it would put even more between you and actually putting out a car. And I think we already have enough there that hinders people from actually getting the car to the masses at the moment.
Yeah, that you do.
Yes, so we're in agreement there for sure. But yes, let's continue on here.
Yep, so we go to the next question. Thank you for that, Martinator. All right, so our next question is from Monsters Energy Zero Ultra. I'll just give you the invite to speak, and we'll get you up here on stage.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hello.
Welcome.
I have first question, and then I'll try to slip one in if you guys let me for the second. But I noticed between this LDU and the last one, you rolled back the torque limiter feature. So I was just this is kind of open-ended, but I was a bit curious, like what other features have you guys wanted to implement before, but couldn't just because of like UI limitations or, I don't know, the sound engine? I've always just been kind of curious about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the general design approach that we're taking is we try to fill a tab of options with the options that have the biggest impact on design, that also at the same time are doable and fun to use. So if we run out of UI space, that means that we have reached a point where we would have to consider getting rid of another feature in order to implement a new one. And well, that is of course not really what we would like to do, because it's kind of double work, and it would mean that we previously have done or evaluated things wrongly or had different circumstances there. I don't know, but usually that doesn't happen. There is one exception, and that is probably the best answer I can give you. Originally, we had in the car designer or engine designer that came out, I think 2014 it was, 2013, 2014, we did have a flywheel. Then we got rid of the flywheel to put other things there. And because it also didn't really play that well, there was not enough nuance to it, and we replaced it with, I can't remember what it was, but there were enough options on there. I think it was VVL, I believe. I thought that was more interesting.
Definitely.
And then we found a better solution for it later on, which freed up UI space. And then we saw, okay, well, now we have space. What do we want to put on there? What is the next best thing we could do? Well, the answer was flywheel. And we still had it in code from before. So it was hooking it up again, revamping the dependencies, and that was it.
And this kind of bleeds into my second question. I mean, I'm sure I have more questions that I come up with, but I'll let other people ask. But mine is, and this is just kind of a dev feature or something. Would you guys ever consider like some sort of key to be able to expose hidden states of certain variables, like, I don't know, crank mass, I don't know, just things that if somebody wanted to take the variables that have been silently constructed inside the engine and use them for a different program, or maybe in their Beam exports to figure out friction for the engine better or something. Would you guys ever consider that, or is it kind of all just a black box and what comes out comes out?
No, I think it's pretty open already. I think we do have the debug console. Chris, do you know if that is always in there?
Yeah, the debug console is always available to players. If you press F9, F9 accesses the debug console, and you can get a whole lot more information in that than just what's available.
Oh, and anything this is blowing my mind.
Anything that's in the F9 menu is theoretically accessible through the API, as I understand it. That's probably a question more for Kaz, but it's very, very early in the morning in New Zealand, and I don't think we really want to bother him just yet with that. So.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. That's really cool. I didn't know that.
Basically all the stats are there. Also, maybe you have seen it, maybe not, but there is the new weights table in the detailed stats that gives you a whole bunch of extra information. Not down to the crank mass, but the crank mass also can be viewed just from the tooltip in the engine designer. But yeah, I guess that was just a general example you were giving there. But yes, so the debug
Sometimes
console would be one avenue to getting more information.
Yeah, sometimes I like to cheat an automation engine into engine sim, even though it's pretty hard, just if I want to get funky with engine audio. So sometimes I'll use like the kilograms per second values they give for intake and convert that to CFM. But I know it can't be perfectly one-to-one between either because they're both simulations. So that's cool to hear. You
Yeah,
guys
and
kick me off now, though.
ours is not even in many parts. It's not a simulation, but just a parameterization. So we many of the dependencies are not first principle, especially compared to what Ange is doing. He's always going from first principle, as far as I understood, and that makes it quite a bit different. It's not one-to-one translatable, but it's just a different beast.
Yeah. Typically, whatever conversion I try to do is pretty bastardized. So it's a fun process through either of them, though. So that's cool to hear with the dev console.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, guys.
You're welcome. So our next question comes from Dude. Dude, welcome.
Hello.
Hi, thank you guys for having me on. I just had a follow-up question from a former video you guys released about the transmission and drivetrain systems. We didn't get any news about it in this little dev update, and I was just curious where we were at with that.
Right, so I can give you a quick update on that. Most of what we were intending to implement is implemented. I didn't choose to not show it off at the moment because some of the translation between the raw data that is coming out of the implemented simulations and the end result that you as the player get is broken. For instance, I was like, should I show this off? This is looking good. I mean, diffs are now working really nicely and you get all the grip calculations done properly. And then what I see next is I'm choosing rear-wheel drive open diff, and it gets a higher off-road score than manual full locker diff, than 4x4 locker diff. So it's like, okay, maybe not just yet. But those are mainly smaller things. Otherwise, all of that is working. I think in the last Q&A that we had, we were briefly touching on, and that's on YouTube as well, we were briefly touching on those simulations of grip versus the diffs, what you've chosen there, how the torque actually filters through the drivetrain to the individual wheels, and so on. And then we're simulating various road grip situations with one tire having less grip or one tire being up in the air, and cycling this around and then doing 20 tests per stat and then averaging them out and then calibrating those results, the average of the tests, calibrating those out to give a multiplier to the stat itself. And that is already all working. It's working for drivability, it's working for sportiness as far as I can tell. So the only one left there to fix up is off-road. And what I've seen so far is very promising, I would say, because all of a sudden I was pretty heavily penalized for making cars with too much power. What would be considered like way over standard power for what a car should have of that type for that age. And what was quite interesting to see is that if you then want to have a car that is way more powerful than the average, you actually do need to go for A, better diffs, or B, for all-wheel drive. And that seemed to be working out really well. So I'm looking forward to seeing that in action once the stats are fixed and make some of the first tests with that. And I think that is such a big topic that you touched on there that would warrant another video before release into open beta to really go through what has changed.
That's my question and also the follow-up. So that's everything I have.
Thank you very much.
The first question we've had is, and it's actually several people who've asked this, is the status of superchargers specifically. I think I'll start by saying that right now we are still working on the superchargers and work continues apace. And The basic art for the superchargers right now, I'd say, is probably about 90% done. Would you say, Rob? Like just
I think so,
the
yeah,
basic
that's fair.
meshes and whatnot?
Some piping remains, I believe.
Well, that's of course the sort of more advanced stuff, is like getting the piping done and getting everything working with scaling and everything. That is quite complicated, and we're maybe 50% done that. And that's kind of what Andrew, Daffy Flyer, is spending a lot of his time working on right now, is just making sure that system all works properly and basically unwinding a whole bunch of bugs that he's found along the way with how that works and making things sort of a little bit more efficient and a little bit more tidy, not just for superchargers, but for all of our piping implementations as well. So it's kind of, we're doing a full pass of all of that art at the same time as we're getting everything set up for the superchargers. In terms of calculations, that is definitely a Kill Rob question, so we'll put it to him.
In terms of calculations, I have not done the research yet, and I have not started implementing it. But what that will entail, you can see it as follows. A supercharger is a turbocharger without a turbine that instead is being driven by the engine and just adds to friction. As such, what it needs is a different compressor map, of course, depending on its type as well. And those need to be modeled. Modeling a compressor map is quite tricky, but obviously, as seen with the turbo compressor maps, that has already been done, and turbo compressor maps are actually more complicated. And as such, I'm quite confident that now that I know how to, in general, do it, that can be done and achieved to a reasonable accuracy without too many issues along the way, as long as there's a solid depository of information on those out there that we can tap into. That is basically superchargers. I'm not so worried about superchargers itself. I mean, the more tricky bit is probably the two-stage stuff, but also that should be quite doable. If you can work out one stage, then working out two things at the same time that are sequentially implemented should not make the system, as far as I can tell, all too much more complex after all. Because one of them will always spool first. Yeah, that's basically the status. So on my calculation end, I haven't started on those yet. The artwork will take till the end of the second milestone to be fully done and tested. Once we have all that in, that is just something that takes quite forever because of how complex it is to get all the different variations hooked up. But yes, so the one-stage, two-stage stuff is... One-stage superchargers is reasonably easy to put in from a calculation standpoint, and a two-stage, which also will allow superchargers as the first stage and turbochargers as the second stage. That is something that I'm anticipating to be a bit of a pain, but definitely possible.
I should also mention as well that Daffy Flyer is really not looking forward to the twin charging art because that gets super complicated very quickly. So I think he's largely got a plan for how that's going to work, but there's, as they always say, no plan survives contact with the enemy, so that may go completely out the window. But it is something that we're going to be working quite hard on here in the next foreseeable future for sure. The next text question that we had come in is asking just a quick status update on multiplayer.
Oh, okay. So multiplayer has been worked on in the background by Jay, and that is mostly the very, very back end of things. So can we connect people to each other that then are able to play against each other in scenarios? And the answer to that is yes. So that is all working already. Two people can load into the same scenario with a time limit and then have a go at it and be rated against each other. That has been prototyped already and is in the background implemented in the game. But we haven't taken that through to implementing all the new UI that is required for that, or reviving some of the old designs. That was Key Engine, right? We had the multiplayer stuff in Key Engine, so we will be inspired by what we had back then, but we are certainly not going to copy any of what we had back then. It was a lot of fun though. So that's the current status on multiplayer.
And I should also mention that keen viewers of our little dev update that we just released earlier in the week may or may not have connected some of the dots that we put in there. I'm not going to say much more than that, but there are some dots in there for you to connect. Onwards with some text questions, or some voice questions, I'm sorry to say.
Alright, so I have two questions relating to the Elisbury update. The first one is, compared to before the update, will the bottom end parts influencing the RPM stress of the other bottom end parts result in overall stronger parts, weaker parts, or mostly the same as before the update?
Compared to before, I think the very high end is more revvy than before. Like what you can achieve is more revvy than before. But overall, I think on the torque side is about the same as before. There are some new components in there, and we still haven't fully settled on the balance. That is going to be first nailed down in the open beta phase, I would say. But the overall goal is to not take away design space from people that they have come to love there, but rather expand it and make it more intriguing in terms of how parts can be combined or need to be thought of on how to combine them. So it will be a bit more interesting to play around with them, and you will have to make some more interesting decisions in terms of considering the weight you put on the con rods and thus on the crank as well. But yeah, so overall it's probably more revvy overall, because we also have more billet options there, where we now split it up into a super high revving crank and a very torque taking crank. So yeah, I think that's at least as powerful as before is the answer.
Alright, thanks. So, second question, regarding the custom tracks, will this be implemented with the Steam Workshop system, or will it be something that users will have to add in manually?
That is a yes to the first option there. The plan is that it is going to be a very easy, a few clicks to export thing in the standalone tool, that is, and where you can choose to either put it straight into your automation mods folders so that you can test it out in the game, but also you would have options to put it onto the workshop from there. So our main goal with this one is that the community gets an editor that is so easy to use and so powerful that we will see a lot of high quality stuff being produced in very short amount of time that we ourselves wouldn't be able to do.
Alright, that's sort of my question answered then. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you for asking them. Okay, we have a request from Texaslav. Give you the invite, and
Hello there. Can everybody hear me?
Hello.
good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I have mostly questions, as many as you'll allow me to have, in terms of the drivetrain updating. So, not long after the last LDU and Q&A, we kind of had a conversation with a bunch of people in game feedback about the new transmission kind of update with the torque limits on those and everything.
Yes.
And I'd like to ask if there was a couple of decisions you had apparently not yet made regarding of how that's going to work, and I was wondering if there's any update on that.
I can't remember what the status back then was, but I can tell you about the status right now. So, gearboxes, I think it was about how they scale, right? It's probably the main question there.
That kind of stuff, yeah.
Yeah. So currently our approach is going to be that the transmission size scales with the overall capacity of the family of the engine. And that means that, or that further means that then the torque limit does scale with the capacity that is tied to. So if you have an engine family that is, let's say, 2 liters, then the gearbox will be 2 times the designated calibration torque limit for that year you produce it in. So it's tied to year as well, of course. They get stronger over time. And so far that seems reasonable. We haven't tested it a lot though. And that is something that would have to be hammered out in more detail and to see if there are other dependencies required to beef them up in certain situations or tone them down a little. But yes, every single gearbox type does have a strength progression over the years as well. And then of course quality plays into it. And well, the engine capacity does scale it overall. And that's the current status of it.
All right. And I really have one other question, and that's about CVTs. So in the new gearing system, right, you can choose your basically top gear speed and first gear speed, which for CVTs would be the entire spread, right?
Yes.
And I was wondering, considering that mechanically speaking, in terms of your rev range, it would be a straight upgrade to make a CVT's range of gearing as long as possible. Will there be any stat or dynamics penalties for CVTs made with a higher
ratio, you mean? Yeah. Or speed ratio.
with a higher gear spread? Yeah.
That is definitely something that we are considering, yes. So in general, also for normal gearboxes, by the way, if you have a free gear gearbox, then having a speed rate or a gear ratio spread of 6 for those gears, for those 3 gears, just doesn't work. The gaps are too large, right? So that would have to be penalized just as much as the CVT that is being pushed to have a too high range in terms of speed ratio. And there needs to be limitations to that. Either it will be a hard limit or it will be a soft limit that is enforced by you then dropping reliability for it.
That kind of was my question, because the difference between a CVT and a conventional is that with the conventional gearboxes, obviously the penalties come by themselves, and that's evident in the current spacing system, where if, for example, your power band is too narrow and your gears are too wide, you just don't get acceleration at all, right? But with a CVT, the last we saw of them in an LDU, it's basically a peak power line from start to finish.
Oh, well, so, almost until you reach the speed ratio.
Yeah, until you you reach the end. And the question basically was, would there be an extra penalty for CVTs just getting a busted, for example, 11-to-1 range of gears?
11-to-1, yeah. You're not going to see 11-to-1s there, but we're going to make sure that doesn't happen. But that's a fair question. I think the penalties need to kick in way earlier than that. I
would agree.
Yeah, I don't want them to be overpowered for any kind of performance use. But my question to you would be, what exactly are you going to build with that in terms of performance, where you need peak power, where you only have available 60 Newton meters per liter?
Oh, don't worry. I'm not worried about it being overpowered for power use. Is just that general gearing, and I do get that, of course, in real life CVTs are kind of OP for economy uses. I am taking that into account. However, I thank you very much for your time, and that's it for me right now.
All right, awesome, thank you. Yeah, the CVTs are funny. Of course, it seems like such a good idea. You do have more friction, by the way, than you do for manuals. So for pure economy driving, if you have a really nice manual, that will likely give you better fuel economy if you can drive the thing properly and you really make use of the gearing in a fuel economy sense. But the CVTs are basically overpowered for bad drivers that try to get good fuel economy. As long as they don't try to drive the thing hard, because then the whole concept falls apart, quite literally.
One more text question here is, with the racetrack rework, are there any plans to add racing to campaign, for example, for research or racing and or awareness or prestige bonuses?
That is something that we haven't discussed yet. This basically boils down to... let me reword the question, and I think that is an accurate view of this, is there going to be some racing that gives in-campaign bonuses to your company? That is something that we have not planned, but it is something that we have discussed in terms of a potential expansion or DLC for the game way down the road when everything is done. So a little bit out of scope for now, but especially with what we are doing now with racetracks and stuff and making them proper nice, making that connection happen at some point makes a lot more sense than it ever did before. So let's leave it at this, I think.
Okay, so we have another voice question from Monster Energy Zero Ultra.
Okay, I kind of got one of my questions answered just now. I was going to ask, given that now you can actually differentiate a car on a track, would you guys consider being able to run multiple vehicles on a track at once in like sandbox or something? Just from the standpoint of, if you're comparing vehicles just based off of times, it's hard to compare their corners, or I don't know. It'd also be very neat. I know this can't really be a focus for a production tycoon game, but it'd be neat just for like community challenges to actually be able to compare cars on the same track simultaneously. So, I don't know. Have you guys considered that?
I just considered that 5 seconds ago after you said it. Is that fine? No, but I think that makes sense. It does make sense to at least have some kind of let your 3 different trims race at the same time or whatever. And with the new calculations, I think that might be possible without too much of a hassle. Yeah, I can't say yes for sure because I haven't thought it through, obviously, in those 30 seconds that I've now thought about it. But I think it's in general a good idea to consider that, to put in. It definitely won't be in this update, but maybe in the next milestone.
I feel like I remember, was there like a community tool a long time ago that allowed that?
Yeah, that is, if you mean the BRC, that was made by Martin. Yes, that was a highly custom way of doing so. He had to download all the car files and then manually insert them into his simulation. That was standalone. And from there, he would be then able to run simulations of all the cars in his own program. So technically, it is possible to do so. And what we have to do is to check if that is feasible or not.
This next one, I hate asking exporter questions because it's like, I know that can never be the priority. But with exporters, it's like for a lot of things, you should just edit the JSON yourself. It's not that hard. But one of the tough things with the exporter is the brake light exports. Because if you compare brake lights in an exported automation car in Beam to a vanilla Beam car, there's some sort of like red particle sprite that kind of appears around the taillights of a Beam car. So would it ever be possible to have some sort of like Beam exporter taillight where it's just an invisible proper object you can, I guess, place inside of a taillight that is just purely for exports that allows like some sort of, I guess, a bit better of a brake light look?
Yeah, I'm definitely not the expert on exporter stuff, but Infinity is here in chat, as I see. And he is definitely the expert on this. So from my point of view, I would think that the answer is that is certainly possible to some extent. And I wouldn't be opposed to that at all. Like, if it's technically possible and feasible to do without a massive pain in the butt, then I would say why not? And Infinity is actually constantly working on improvements. So depending on the list of priorities he currently has, that could be added to that list at some position that is reasonable, and I can't judge where it would belong.
Yeah, my respect for Infinity is really high. The way it exports is really cool, and I couldn't have done it in a million years. And then one final thing just to slide in there. Would you guys ever consider, and maybe I've missed it, but in photo mode, sometimes it'd be nice to take a photo with the like actual roll of the car shown in the photo, like as if a car is hitting a corner hard or something, especially like a high high ride height SUV, would you guys ever consider possibly implementing the ability to control not just like the rotation of the car but the like a per side suspension offset?
I thought that was already in.
Oh, is it?
It is.
Shit.
Yep.
My bad. Okay,
A
I'm learning more and
surprise,
more.
new feature.
Yeah. Developer mode or developer console and this. I've learned so much already. But besides that, that's about all the questions
All
I
right.
had.
Thank you very much.
So just to expand on that, yes, in the photo mode, it is actually completely possible to control at every corner of the car the ride height of each wheel. So you can actually set the car up to have a little bit of body roll and then have the suspension adjust accordingly as well. So it actually gives the car a little bit of a dynamic stance in the pictures that you're taking.
So now we just need a proper racetrack photo scene, you mean?
And we also need to figure out a way to get wheel blur into the ray traced
Shit.
photos.
Yeah, no, that is...
That's almost
Wheel
that's a
blur
really,
is something
really
that
difficult.
I always have to do in Photoshop afterwards, yes. I think that's a limitation of Unreal 4, though, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And even just the thought of that has made poor Isaac just start pulling his hair out, and he has no idea why. So we have a couple text questions here from one of our users, and that is, in terms of engine roughness, how does that translate? Yes, smoothness,
Okay.
roughness, same sort of thing, just opposite ends of the spectrum. How does that translate into sort of like a real-world measurement, and sort of what would be considered acceptable values, and what is the maximum possible sort of roughness? I mean, unless it is, as I understand it, basically just implemented on a 0 to 100 scale, effectively.
It is, yeah. I could pull up the calculations there and have a closer look, but the gist of it is that we are looking at the very nature of the vibration, second order imperfections in vibrations there for the different engine types, and that is then modeled into the base stat for the engine. From there we go and look at the capacity of the engine and the stroke, of course, so piston speeds and whatnot, to determine how pronounced those are. And then we consider how much if that kind of engine does have a balance shaft option and whatnot, how much that can be offset by balance shafts and, of course, the harmonic damper. But basically what you could say is 50 is a perfectly acceptable value for normal consumer engines. And you get really quite rough at the 40 level. 30 I wouldn't recommend anyone put into an engine bay. And if you want something that feels luxurious or like nice and smooth, it would be 70 plus. That is about the scale we're going for.
Okay, so the next question is, and this is one that we actually answered from our little dev update, is when you're showing stats for competitor cars in campaign, is it possible to get even more stats? For example, stats from the test track mode. And the answer to that is, with the new Sankey charts, yes, it is absolutely possible to see the stats of every competitor car that you are playing against.
As long as we save them out into the database of competitor cars, because the thing is the following, like all the competitor cars are not faked. They were generated just like the player builds these cars. And the only thing that happens then is that these results are culled and put into a database, and we can decide on what stats should go in there. So yes, all stats would be available, even test track times if we want to spend the time and let every single car out of how many cars are there in this database? I think like 4,000 something. They would have to all run the test track, and that would take some time. But we do have it set up on server, so that's not your problem, right? So technically, all that would be possible to show any stats like this, and also a design summary, like you get on the final car summary page that you have. That with all the main design choices that were made, that would also be possible to show in principle. We just have to first put it into that database to be able to be shown.
Okay, so Crummy, we finally got your tin cans and string set up for you to speak. Go ahead.
Oh yes. I have just one question. Will the weight sled, like the weight distribution slider.
Yes.
Sorry for my English. Weight distribution slider, the slider that controls the weight, like percentage. Yes.
Yeah. Get what you mean. Those two sliders.
Will it work in Beam?
Well, it should, because the one slider does affect the overall weight slider does affect the weight of the passenger compartment boxes, because it mostly affects the weight of the insulation, and the total weight of the car should be modeled with the correct weight distribution that the car has into the node weights of the car that is being exported to Beam. It should be working, but I haven't checked that in a long time. So I don't know what the current status on it, but the intention is that it should be working.
Yeah, I mean, I think it hasn't been working like ever.
Maybe that's
in Beam,
maybe that's the case. We will have to definitely investigate and just check if it's working as intended.
But that's it for me.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so another question that came in, we'll have a text question, and then we got a couple more voice questions lined up here. This is with regards to the poster mode, and that is, will it be possible to change the statistics that are shown in the posters or not?
The poster mode is fully modelable. So whatever people come up with, you can put stuff in there the way you like, if you're a little handy with modding and changing up what stats you want to display. These things that I've shown off are our very first drafts of that is slightly polished up, not really, slightly polished up poster defaults that you can use. But what we expect to happen with it being fully moddable is that people will just craft their own defaults with their own stats on it and just make whatever they want, and hopefully share it with the community. That should mark that down as another item that should be a workshopable item, like poster presets, poster defaults. So, but yeah, that's the intention there.
Send the invite for our next voice question.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Willem.
Welcome.
I have 3 questions.
Okay.
The first one is the whine of the superchargers. Will we have the ability to control, like a lot of production cars, they won't have any whine because they're dampening it on purpose, while if it's a tuner car, a lot of them would intentionally have whine. Will we be able to control that? Would that be determined by the size of the supercharger? That's my first.
Very likely we would be tying it to some parameter if we are going to have it. And I would assume that we will have some kind of sound effects for the superchargers. That just makes sense. So it will have to be tied to some parameter that naturally comes about for that. So that more racy setups naturally do get the whine and others don't.
The other question that is less about the update, but hopefully I would love to have it eventually. Will we eventually have load cell tuning for our engines? Is that something that you've looked into?
Load cell tuning? I have to say, I don't even know what that is. Chris, you probably know what it is, though. So
you can change. So it's how a real engine gets tuned on a dyno. So it's the air fuel ratio plus being able to change the timing in each cell. So there'll be like several hundred cells on a graph.
Like manual tuning of the AFR map, you mean, or timing map?
Yes.
That is definitely not something that is coming, because it's already perfect, and it is like by definition perfect at the moment. That's how the calculations work. There is nothing to gain from changing the timing. You can only lose changing the timing with how it is optimized at the moment, and thus there is no reason to do that timing work or setup work, the load cell work that you reference, in the way we have implemented things, because everything is related to peak torque timing, and thus you already know exactly where the perfect spot is, and the game automatically chooses the map so that it gets as closely to the perfect setting, as close to the perfect setting as you can get. So there is nothing to optimize there for you with the current calculations going on. So no, that's also there are two guys on the team who have actually done that themselves on their cars, and they said it was absolutely atrocious to do so. So why would we have that in the game, right? It is really tedious.
Yeah, well, I mean, I like to hate myself sometimes, but
I think it is funny if you do it once. So, but why would we have a mechanic in there that is only fun if you do it once? Like, that is a lot of work for something like this. So that's unfortunately a no. And I think the reason for it, that it's already optimized by definition, is probably good enough there. But yes, you had a third one, right?
Yes. So I guess I have a fourth question that ties into the third one. Will we eventually have an anti-lag option to keep the turbo spool for like rally cars or like race cars? And will we eventually have Baja or like rally suspension that has, like very high like extension?
So anti-lag is basically something that is, as far as I understand, not compatible with catalytic converters at all, because it just fries them. And as such, that is not a production car thing. And automation being about production cars, that means that is basically a no-no. It is not planned, at least. And then the same goes for the bar suspension, because that is something that would have to be... well, first of all, we would have to have UI space for it. Then others would say, why do you implement bar suspension when you don't implement swing axle? Like, you idiots. So... We're definitely not going to choose something that is purely for a specific type of racing, when there would be other options that would be ahead of on the list for that are relevant to production cars. So the priorities there are that way around. So that's unfortunately a double no there.
All right. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We have another question from Texas Slav. Get you up on stage here and go ahead.
Howdy. I got this question in my mind because you answered the question on the smoothness scale. And this is a question that's kind of connected to the challenges seen on our forums. And that is, what exactly is going on with the loudness scale? And is it accurate and intentional that performance options for the intake are so much more impactful than ones for exhaust?
Yes, that is very intentional in terms of... the way it works is you have two stats that are kind of working behind the scenes that you
I've
never
seen
see.
them on the CSV exporter.
Ah, okay, yes. And that is the loudness of the intake and the loudness of the exhaust. So what the game does is that it checks which one is the louder of the two, and then takes that one as the main one, and then slightly considers the other one and puts it on top of it, so that you kind of get the loudest one matters more than the other one. And the thing that happens with the intakes that are the sporty type is that they more or less give you a direct path to the engine, to the outside, from the engine to the outside world, and thus you hear the intake noise a lot louder than you do with the so-called standard intakes. So that is why you're seeing this effect where it suddenly basically switches over to only mattering on the intake side, because, well, the exhaust can't really be made much different in terms of loudness there. You have to pump a lot of power through and then not use any exhaust. Then you get ridiculous values, of course. But that is what is going on. You can now argue, and I would like to hear it, of course, in a reasonable capacity, if that is an overtune system, that is the intakes, the performance intakes have too much loudness. That could very well be the case. That is just the design question, or the balance question, though, not design question, the balance question.
Okay, so I'm not sure entirely personally, as I'm not some kind of consummate performance car driver, whether or not the system is accurate, but it does seem a bit counterintuitive, and a lot of players on the forum have definitely looked at it that way. The way I see it, I mean, when you look at videos, let's say, of cars, you're gonna see a situation where a loud intake is a lot more noticeable on the inside, whereas from the outside, especially after a car is obviously especially after a car is passed, you
Yes.
basically only hear the exhaust.
Yeah. All these
Even
values
if-
are for the inside of the car, by the way.
Oh, okay. So the loudness stat is mostly for what the
Drivers.
driver
Yep,
hears. So
exactly.
in that case, that's very logical. And I would assume that with the previous question about the whole supercharger sound thing, there would be an intake that would sound more like a Mercedes compressor engine, and so basically kind of more normal. And then there'd be the whole Hellcat deal of the whine.
Yes. If we can get that to work, then the answer is yes. That still remains to be seen. But it would be awesome, indeed. Yes.
In case I'm not being too greedy here, regarding intakes, I think a lot of people have had that question about whether any sort of rebalance or reimagination of the variable option is coming at all.
In what
Because
terms? Because I think
the
it's doing its job.
Well, the variable option is supposedly, I guess, the way I've heard it expressed, kind of a combination of standard mid and performance high, right?
Yes, both done in a poor way. Yes, exactly. In a less optimized way. Yes.
Yeah,
But maybe not high, but it's somewhere in between there, like between performance mid and high.
Yeah, in some very good conditions, I have somewhat managed to make it act a bit better than performance mid on comparison, like with both mostly optimized for size. But I was wondering if there was any ability for the lower end to be made a bit stronger, because I mean, if you see real life variable manifolds, you'll have very long primaries.
Right. Really optimized for low RPM, yeah.
So I don't think, of course, it'd be like 0 and 70 VVL. That's kind of absurd. But it would be nice to see a bit of a serious low-end boost rather than just, okay, it's standard mid, but then it somewhat goes higher, because currently variable adds a, pardon my French, buttload of unreliability.
Yes.
With the only advantage over something like performance mid, in most cases, being that it's slightly less loud.
Right. Okay, so you're advocating for a boost at lower RPM. That's literally a change that takes me like 5 minutes to implement. So it's just a balance thing. And
an hour to think
very
about,
easy
yeah?
to tweak. Yeah, so it's something to think about. One of the main things that I would be looking at is to make sure that it isn't better than the dedicated low range options. As long as
definitely
that is
not.
as long as
Standard
that is
low
the
still
case-
could be king.
Okay, yes. As long as that is the case, then it can be buffed. So I'll look into that.
Just a little bit of make variable occasionally worth even considering.
Yeah, so you say the reliability penalty is quite high at the moment?
Yes, and I would rather it remain high, because people have been having lots of problems with them,
lots of
butterfly
problems.
valves and all that. But have a little bit of payoff for that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. It should have. So I'll take a look at it.
Yeah, thank you very much for the consideration.
Okay, thank you. And I should mention that as an owner of a car with a variable length intake, the reliability penalty is absolutely warranted. Believe me, it has been nothing but hassle. And a lot of people with the similar cars as my poor BMW would say the same thing. But maybe that's just a BMW thing, that they just can't figure things out like that.
Stupid Germans.
Always overcomplicating things. Okay, another question here, and this is kind of a long-standing question that we get occasionally.
Diesels?
No, this one is actually not one that we get all the time and is answered by the fact. This one is, with regards to the Steam Workshop, has there ever been any thought to giving players the ability to share their in-game designed cars, basically essentially sharing a .car file through the workshop, or are we still not going to do that?
I think the answer to that is still we don't want that because it would absolutely flood the workshop with, let's say, questionable designs. And there would be in the haystack quite a few excellent designs as well that we see in the car showcase here, for instance, on our Discord server. But I don't think it is a... It would add a lot of noise to the workshop. And I think that is our general stance on that. We have not considered changing that as far as I know.
I'd like to add to that from a community manager point of view is that it would be a moderation nightmare.
Oh, that's
because
true.
there'd be so many entries coming in that would be almost impossible for us to screen all of them. I should also add that if you look at the BeamNG mod repository, they have currently, I think it's about 18 or 1900 BeamNG mods, and then they have approximately 17,000 automation export cars.
Yeah.
And it's, even with that extra step of exporting your automation car to BeamNG and uploading it to the mod repository, they have that many. One can only imagine how many .car files we would have uploaded to
I feel sorry
Steam
for
Workshop.
them that we have done that to them, but there are also good ones among there. You can I assure you, there are good mods in there.
There are some absolutely fantastic mods in there, but there's also a whole bunch that are, well, shall we say a little questionable. So another text question here is with regards to our auto-generated competitors in campaign mode. Will they ever go as far as to have textures and fixtures and design on them, or will they continue to just be blank red thumbnails?
Ah, yes. We have sought solutions for that for a long time. So currently our best guess is that we are at some point going to attempt to make those more fleshed out and actually use fixtures and full designs of cars. Can AI do that? The answer is maybe, but not really. So the solution comes back to the community itself. So our current thought of solution is as follows. When players complete a design, they, in Sandbox for instance, they would be able to submit that design for curation to be added to the pool of general designs of campaign cars, AI campaign cars. And then we decide on our end, is this a good entry and where would we place it? Like what style does that fall into and so on. And then our AI companies would go and then just say, oh, I'm going to choose this style and I need a car from this year in this category, like luxury 1955, right? And then grab a design from there that fits with the general design keywords or whatever that they try to follow as a company, so that they have some kind of consistent design. So there's a lot of curation in there, but I think that's the only way to actually make that work and look good. Otherwise, that really would become a meme very soon, with people just going around and looking at terrible designs from AI companies. I mean, that would be funny, but it kind of takes a bit of the immersion away from the game itself. So that's our current design goal with that. But if we reach it or not, that remains to be seen once we focus more on campaign again.
Okay, we got a text question here from Zenturi. Give you the invite and get you up on stage. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. First things, I want to say I really appreciate the amount of work you guys put into the game. I can't put it into words. But anyway, so my question would be that, so with the fact that you guys are adding multiplayer in the near future, would you ever consider adding a multiplayer feature into the campaign? As I've been speaking to a few other people, and we thought it would be really cool to do like a campaign together, but it would be really difficult to align timelines. So I was just wondering if there was an idea to add a multiplayer feature to the campaign.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks. And then second of all, we have thought about that a lot. And since the early days, we always said there would be campaign multiplayer to some extent. Or we always thought we would be able to have that. And we have thought about it a lot, and nowadays we say that is likely not really possible. Or well, it would be possible, but extremely difficult. And let me give you the reasons for it. And you have already touched on them. Like the main problem you've already discovered yourself. It is time. So consider the following: a game runs for roughly 80 years, so it's 74 years, right?
Yeah.
And designing a car, a full lineup, takes roughly 30 minutes. You would be, and that's per player, right? So you would be probably designing, let's say, 20 to 30 models in a proper campaign playthrough as a player. So that's 20 to 30 times 30, which is
that's a lot.
That's let's say 15 hours worth of game time, right?
Yeah.
And that is just designing cars. Then comes the whole campaign stuff and managing factories and pricing and all that kind of good stuff, right? That is a lot of time. So we thought about various modes for time, how we could pace it. We thought about a mode where 1 year would be 1 day in reality.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking.
Yeah, so that would kind of work, so that you can that we making it such that 2 hours is basically 1 month, right? That would be what it comes down to.
It would leave enough time to design cars.
It would leave enough time to design cars whenever you need to, but it also would mean that sometimes you have a gap of 3 to 5 days where you wouldn't do shit. So,
that's also very true.
And I don't quite know how well that would flow. It would be a very hardcore thing. The other extreme would be to ask, how can you make the game, full campaign play in one session of gameplay? Let's say one session of gameplay would be 2 to 4 hours, right? That would be a long session of gameplay. But that would be a speed run of a campaign.
That would be an absolute speed. Could you even do that in?
Yeah, that's my question. Could you even, like, at that point,
is it even
1
possible?
year doesn't take a long time at all. Like, it would take you just like 3 to 4 years to design one car. Like, whoa, hold on there. That would be the most stressful experience ever. So I don't see how, because we are missing that middle ground, that it would be workable. I'm not seeing how we could make that. And if the community has suggestions, of course we are all ears, because that originally was a goal to put in there. But we thought about it a lot, and we have not found a solution that was just like clicking and doing, that would work.
I feel like a way you could implement this, and this is just me thinking off the top of my head right now, is that you could leave timeline, like the actual time it takes to do a campaign, up to the player, and maybe even make it in a way that on a set time you can pause the time in the game, or you can speed times up in the game, and leave that to the community of that, or the people playing that campaign, to all commonly decide. Like the way that I would do thinking about this is, I'm going to use Minecraft as an example. You know, when you're going to sleep and you need a certain amount of people for the night to skip, I feel like that's a way you could maybe do it, but I'm not a developer. I don't know exactly how that would all work.
Right, so a non-continuous flow of time.
Yeah.
So that you could pause at some points, or it's on a on-demand pausing basis.
Pretty much, yeah.
I think
So
that kind of approach would need a scheduling function that you say, okay, in 1.5 years game time, I want to pause the game to do X, right?
Yeah.
That then becomes an issue with
someone drops
events that happen that you need to react to, because that is entirely non-reactionary, right? And I wouldn't know how you would deal with those, because then you have like 1.5 years past, but after 2 months of that had passed, and you were away and not scheduled to do anything, you had a QA issue, and now
Yeah.
that you didn't
And now
address.
you've produced millions of cars, yeah.
Yes. Or your competitor has come out with something that will make you go like, oh, maybe I should not put this thing into production after all, or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. You see that it is
Yeah, there's
quite
a lot
difficult.
More to it than there's a lot more to it than what meets the eye.
Yeah, for sure.
I understand that, yeah. It would be really cool to see it though. If you guys can figure that out, I mean, I'd be happy to try and help, but if you guys could figure that would be absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I agree. It would be. Let's hope it happens at some point. But
I really do as well.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Anyway, I'm going to leave you guys to it. Take care. Bye-bye.
So as we were talking about the loudness, we had a text question come in, and that is, what do those values equate to? Is it just a simple 0 to 100 scale, or is there a real world unit that it?
It goes
is
beyond
equivalent
100, and it's not a unit that is measurable. It's just a completely fudged scale that gives you some kind of reference point, where 60 is something that you would consider to be sitting in a sports car that is modest, let's say. You hear it properly, engine is audible inside, and it sounds good, but it's not grinding you down as you drive 100 kilometers with it. That's 60. And then modest, yes, so Texlev, modest for a sports car, right? So a normal car would be, let's say, around 40 would be okay. And luxury, you want to be down there in the low 30s. And if you want to build something proper racy track car-like, then I would aim for something around 70 to 80, but not beyond that. So that is just giving you a rough scale, but there's no unit to it, there's no physics to it, it's just like a scale that works somehow.
So we're starting to run out of questions, it sounds like. If anybody has them, we'll take a few more, and then I think we'll wrap up our session for the day. We got another text question coming in. Actually, a couple of them here. The first one is, people are asking, would it be possible to expand our tooltips to explain a little bit better in detail stuff like the loudness and smoothness, where it isn't necessarily obvious what the values mean?
Well, if there was something meaningful to them, then we could. But what would you put there if that is an arbitrary value? Like for smoothness, to explain it, there is something like there is a scale to it. 100 would mean no vibrations at all, and you don't reach that. But some like a V12 would get reasonably close if you make it quite small and really well balanced in general, like with smoothing options and whatnot, and like really good internals and so on. But like how would you put that on a scale and explain it, even if you could? Like what would that be? I don't know. I think the only thing that makes sense that does explain it to some degree is points of reference. Like what would this thing be? What would that thing be? And having that in the tooltip all the time, I don't know, that would probably clutter a bit too much, so it would have to be in some kind of description instead. Description box. But how many people do read those? I don't know. Probably not many. Yeah, I don't know how to best handle those. I mean, it's a legitimate concern and question, but I don't know how to do it any better than what we have with how the stats are working.
Okay, next question is there any news on in-game challenges coming? I think we might need a little bit more elaboration on that, whether it means multiplayer or
no, that's
like
scenarios.
Scenario play in general.
Yeah, scenario play. So they were removed because balance was old. And that, of course, balance has not settled. And making scenarios work and balance them is a lot of work. Like the set of scenarios that we have at the moment probably takes a good month worth of effort, plus a set of probably 10 community members that are just cramming out the best solutions possible that I then can take in and use to balance those scenarios out. And then that is iteratively done several times in a row. After, of course, the scenarios are all set up with the new mechanics and so on. And it just takes a lot of time. And then comes along some damn killrob and changes some balance around, and then everything is broken again. It's like, that sounds like fun. So that's why scenarios were removed in the first place, for now. We do intend to bring them back, but the overall goal with 4.3, like the supercharger update that is, so with its individual milestones, is to finally bring balance to a settled place where we could lock the balance for scenarios and then have them, so to say, separately work on that balance that we have found to be good or good enough, while we then can continue tweaking other little things that won't break everything before then. So anything that is entirely new features, of course, make it very much impossible to do any kind of scenarios right now. Scenarios are very important because they are a gateway to learning the game. And we are fully aware of that, especially in terms of tutorials. And even more super especially with how damn complex automation has become now, with emissions and the whole 2D maps everywhere and stuff. It's super overwhelming for any new player coming into this that is not a car nut. And we can't assume that everyone is. And so we are very much aware of them being missing and be very important. But I think this will be worked out as part of multiplayer coming in. Because multiplayer is going to be based on scenarios, on randomly generated scenarios. You cannot randomly generate scenarios without knowing the bounds of them. And that means that we do need to have a good grasp on balance before we can make balanced multiplayer happening. And that in turn means at that point we can make scenarios happen again, in general. And that is scheduled for, I think, normal scenarios for 4.3.2, so the second, the Alrilma update, so the next milestone. And then I don't know how well we can finish it all off there so that we don't have to rebalance at all. But that remains to be seen. That would be, of course, a dream that we only have to balance scenarios once. But potentially with any changes that are necessary to make scenarios work better, or the game better in general, they could have another update then for the third milestone in this update cycle. That would also finish off the designers as a whole.
Okay, so next question is, do we have any update on the priority of reworked engine sounds and or recolorable badges and decals?
Engine sounds have been worked on for the last major update, I believe. Like, all of them were revised. So I think this is the never-ending story of, I don't like this engine sound. No, I love it. No, I don't like this one. But I love this one. So it's a matter of taste for the most part. If you can point to things that are just obviously broken, then of course we're going to try and fix them. But are there? Is there anything left that is just outright broken? Or is it now just a matter of taste? I don't agree that the V12 sounds like a luxury engine. It should sound like a supercar. Well, someone else says the exact opposite. That's the problem with sounds, right? There's no right answer. Apart from the situations where they actually are broken, and there still might be in there some some examples of that. I don't know at this moment, but you tell me.
Well, there are a couple situations where we have a couple broken engine sounds, specifically, well, more in relation to BeamNG exports. We are aware of that.
Right. The RoboSix sounds.
Robot sounds.
Yeah.
That one we're still working on, and I think actually Caswell has a pretty good idea what the cause of that is. So he's going to go in and fix that. It's just a matter of what happens is the way our engine sounds work is we have procedurally generated, essentially, engine samples. And for every RPM level, you're playing one sample that's blending into another and blending into another as you go up and down the rev range. And what's happened there is we think we may have set an offset into the samples. So we're getting some weird noise building in certain rev ranges, just because of how the samples are blending into one another. That shouldn't be a terribly difficult fix to make, but it's something I think we're going to have a look at it here with this update coming up, but I'm not really sure. We've still got a bunch of things we have to cross off that list before we can get into the open beta, but it's something we will be having a look at. In terms of the badges and recolorable text, that is something we are still looking at working on. That's not really a question that either Rob or I can answer. I think that's more of a Jay and then Andrew question, because essentially what we're doing is we're taking our old system for badges, which basically just only allowed for chrome badges, and treating it more like any other fixture with how materials and stuff are handled. And apparently it's not a terribly straightforward thing to change, but it shouldn't be outrageously difficult either. It's more just a matter of figuring out when we have time in our schedule of updating things to get that taken care of.
And I think decals are going to have a new system now that Isaac already has implemented.
Yes, that is true.
There is something completely new coming where you can do custom material. I don't quite know how that works. Maybe you know better, Mr. Chips?
I sure do. Basically what Isaac is doing is he's allowing people to import custom materials into certain aspects of the game, which could, in theory, allow you to do a full racing livery that you can apply to your car. Bear in mind that does mean you're working around our incredibly curse-looking UV masks on our bodies, which are hugely messy for anybody who's ever had a chance to look at automation modding. So if you can work around those, you can basically do whatever you want in terms of a racing livery or any kind of livery on your car. It's going to be janky, but it is possible, or should be possible. And I believe that's actually going to be implemented into just like custom materials that you can put into fixtures and stuff. Let's see here. A couple more questions and I think we'll wrap it up here for the day. The question here is it possible to change carbureted engine's rev limiter to a soft type rather than the current cut type? The over-rev part could be calculated by the mass flow and retardation of the timing and valve flow. The answer to that is that would be a completely different system to what we have for all the other engines, and I'm not really sure we have the time or necessarily the willingness to do that.
No, I think it's the correct answer, yes. Also, another question I would ask is how much gameplay value does that actually add? Because yes, they didn't have rev limiters and you had to be careful yourself, but how does that matter for cars built in automation? And you can already set the rev limiter higher if you want to, and thus accept a lower reliability. So why don't you just do that? Like, what gameplay effect would be added by having that be a soft limit? I just don't see it. Maybe Maybe I'm blind to the obvious benefit from having that open, but at the moment I don't see it being a good add to the game with how much it would change an existing system that just works well, apart from it not being entirely realistic for old engines.
I guess our last question for the day here is workshop scenarios. Would it be possible for, well, I guess, so the question is, will we eventually have them? And I guess sort of the expansion to that is, would it be possible for people to create their own scenarios and then upload them to the workshop?
The answer to that is that I do have, since about, I think 5 years ago, I do have a UI draft for custom scenarios that you yourself can make. And what I would envision there is that people can make their own library of scenarios, like a series of scenarios, not just one, because spamming one scenarios onto the workshop is about as good an idea as allowing people to put their .car files on there. But in general, if we can find a good solution to nonsense spammed onto the workshop, then absolutely yes, because sharing those as workshop items would be pretty awesome if the quality is generally high. And how to enforce that, I don't know, you probably can't. But having entire challenge series there, that like you make a challenge pack of 10 different scenarios, for instance, that would be awesome to have on there. And we do have, with the planned custom scenario creator, the tools to make them. So I think Isaac at some point spent a week or so, maybe a little less, actually working on making that possible already, like the first stages of implementing that feature. So it's definitely something that we have planned, yes.
Okay, well, I think that's basically all the questions we're going to be doing today. Thank you, everybody, for showing up, and thank you for your questions. Some of them were really quite good, and I think some of them even given us some pause for thought and some ideas for things that we're going to be looking at later on. So thank you, everybody, for showing up. We really do appreciate it. And as Rob will say, we will see you all next time.
I shall see you guys next time.